Hi guys, so today's video is going to be a look at some of Barnes & Noble's book talk recommendations. I am cheating for this very first one. It's not technically fantasy, but I did want to mention it, and that would be Scythe by Neil Shusterman. This is was supposed to be a utopia where mankind has conquered death. We have made such advancements in medicine. We have also made peace across various different peoples and countries, so there's no war. Disease is not a fear for anyone at this point. The only threat to mankind is overpopulation, and therefore mankind's solution to this is having a revered group of individuals known as Scythes, whose job it is to decide that somebody is going to die. And when they make that decision, the things that human beings have within them now that allows for their bodies to heal, that is almost like deactivated, and if that person is killed by a Scythe, they are permanently dead. It's absolutely a premise that you have to suspend disbelief for, but I love this trilogy. I think it brings up so many fascinating concepts, and I also think it does so in a way that is not pretentious, because there can be times where when we're talking about more philosophical type things, it can kind of a little bit start to stretch into something that becomes almost too abstract, and I feel like Neil Shusterman does a great way of taking these more difficult concepts and making it very digestible and approachable for younger audiences, because it is technically young adult. I also think he mixes in a very interesting amount of humor. I loved the humor in it. It's quite dark, but I found it very interesting. And I also think there are certain things coming up in society, even now, our real world, that I feel like this trilogy kind of almost predicts. I am a big fan. This one gets a plus from me. Good job, Book Talk. I do like this series. Next up, we have From Blood and Ash. This one has definitely gained a lot of popularity, and I suppose in a sense that might be because of Book Talk. Not really sure. I definitely saw it a lot on Bookstagram, but either way, this is a story that is a little bit based in paranormal type of things, but it's also kind of like a traditional fantasy kingdom, and there's a girl who has to keep herself absolutely pure for the safety of her people. The book really kicks off, though, when this very pure character decides she doesn't really want to stay pure, and she wants to find out what it's like to be impure. And that's the way in which they kind of look at it, the way she looks at herself. She doesn't really know if her purity actually has anything to do with the safety of her kingdom, and she's eager to find out. But she's also a little hesitant, because she's like, but what if it does, though? I don't want to kill everybody by having a good time. So this story, in my opinion, is very entertaining. It was a little romance heavy, and if you like romance, you're probably going to eat this up. I do think, though, that if you're not that big of a romance reader, that this one is going to be a miss for you. I did find it to be entertaining, but I also think the writing is very basic, and the emphasis really is on the like, will they, won't they, sexy time. For me, this one, I would say it doesn't get a plus or a minus in my personal taste, but if you're somebody who likes the romance in their fantasy books, you're just looking for a good time, you're looking for a fun time, then this one is going to be a plus for you. Next up, we have These Violent Delights. This is a YA fantasy Romeo and Juliet retelling. We follow some characters in the 1920s Shanghai from different gangs. So not only is it the Romeo and Juliet, but also kind of the West Side Story feel. Ironically, this one, despite its premise, is perhaps not as romance heavy as you would expect. The main thing that really drives the plot is that there's this very disgusting illness that's kind of taking over that makes people want to like claw their throats out, and people don't know what's going on, but it's plaguing the nation. And so the two characters from these two rival gangs who have a dark past, you don't really know what happened with them, they sort of have to come together, and there's a lot of tension, and they have to come together despite being on different gangs and try to figure out what the heck is going on for the safety of both of their groups. I quite enjoyed this one. I'm definitely very eager for the sequel, so it gets a plus from me. I do think, though, that it leans a little bit young. It's dark and it gets violent, but it is definitely YA. It's not as romance heavy as, like I said, you might expect, so if you're looking for that, it might be a miss for you, but overall, I thought it was really great, and I thought it was very creative in its grotesque moments. Next up, we have The Wolf of Orin Yaru. This is an adult fantasy that follows a queen who you don't know what happened, but her and her husband are separated. They have a son together, and for her son's sake, she really wants to try to find her husband, reconcile, try to maintain peace, because their marriage is very important for that specific thing. The peace is very fragile within their kingdom, and so she's doing what she can to try to find him and come to terms. But in trying to do this, things kind of get thrown at her that she's not expecting, and she has to use her wit to try and keep herself safe, try to find her way back to her son, and try to maintain power. I quite enjoyed this one. It gets a plus from me. I think if you're just getting into adult fantasy, that this one might be a little bit heavier on the world building, but if you're somebody who is very used to epic fantasy, it's a little bit less so, and so it's kind of a nice cozy in between. It's also first-person narration, but with an emphasis on world building, specifically with the politicking, I would say. Next up, we have Cruel Prince by Holly Black. This is a fae story. The fae are very wicked. We follow a human girl who is living in the fae world. She's very much looked down upon, but she is trying to gain some power by being able to lie when the fae cannot. So I think that if you're somebody who enjoys the wickedness of your fictional fae stories, that this is going to be one that you absolutely adore. But if you're somebody who likes like really cute love stories and super healthy relationships, probably not your cup of tea. I did enjoy the trilogy as a whole. I was a little underwhelmed with the ending, and I didn't love the first one as much as most people, but the second one, I just so enjoyed the scheming and the manipulation of how the fae can technically not be lying, but they can basically be lying. I really enjoyed that aspect of the second one. I thought it was very edge of your seat, suspenseful. You never really knew who to trust. And for that reason, it does get a plus from me. But if you're somebody who does not like that darker romance, fae wickedness, then it's not gonna be your thing. Next up, we have Shadow and Bone and Six of Crows. I have a whole playlist about these, and I know there's a TV show, so it probably doesn't require me to go too in-depth as far as the plot goes. The two stories are quite different from one another, so I think that it depends on your reading tastes. I've always said I think Shadow and Bone is fantastic for people who are coming out of middle grade and into YA fantasy, but that doesn't, of course, mean that you have to be in that age range. I'm somebody who enjoys most age ranges for fantasy, so I quite like that story. I think it's kind of more your typical Chosen One story, and it's a great entryway point in my opinion. Six of Crows is more character focused, and specifically it goes into a lot of the trauma with the characters, which I also greatly appreciated. I like how distinct they are from one another while still taking place within the same world. So yes, definitely a plus from me. I think BookTube and BookTok are in agreement on this one. Next up, we have Mask of Mirrors. I was actually really excited to see this one on the list because it's a little bit newer, and it follows a kind of Venetian setting where we have a woman who is a con artist who's trying to con her way into this family, make them believe she's some long-lost relative, so that way she can have access to their status and their wealth, not realizing that this family is on the brink of bankruptcy, basically, and they're falling out of this society, this high-class society. So they're very suspicious of her, more so than they likely would have been otherwise, and so she's having to try extra hard as a con artist. And on top of that, there's some mysterious things going on within the city. I thought this was very fascinating. The magic in the story is a little bit different from the higher class and the lower classes, and that's something that I don't feel like I fully quite understand just yet in only reading the first book, but that I'm excited to learn more about. There's kind of a dream magic, and then I always describe it as a fortune teller magic. It has to do with cards and things like that, but it can get quite dark, and I really liked it. I liked the characters. I liked exploring this interesting world with them. So yes, another plus from me. Next up, we have This Savage Song by V.E. Schwab. I'm just gonna go right out and say it's a plus from me, although it's not gonna be everybody's liking, of course, like all of these. But this one specifically is a YA fantasy that takes place in what is basically our world, where evil acts have turned into monsters. There are different kinds of monsters, some of which look much more like humans and can even pass as humans. So we have a main character that is a human and a main character that looks to be one but is not. It is a duology, which I really like, that there's only 2 books in the story. It's not any huge commitment or anything like that. In typical V.E. Schwab fashion, it's very kind of dark and wicked, and she just has this bloodiness to her stories, this creepy factor that's so unique and unlike anything else. It's kind of trademark V.E. Schwab, and I think it's definitely present here. I think it's a great book for the fall, so yes, highly recommend. I greatly enjoy it. But what I will say is if you're somebody who appreciates the concept of this but prefers things to be grittier and darker and maybe more adult, the YA age range is going to keep it from getting too far into those things. Next up, we have House of Salt and Sorrows. I loved this book when I read it. I thought it was such a good time, but it is going to be a miss for people who do read a lot of scary books. I don't read a lot of scary books. I thought it was scary because I don't read a lot of scary books, because I'm a wimp. The setup is it is a dark 12 Dancing Princesses retelling. We follow a character who has a giant family, and these sisters keep dying, and she doesn't know why. None of them know why. Some people think their family is cursed. There's this creepy manor by the sea, and she is just slowly starting to see creepier and creepier things happen. And the whole manor by the sea makes it very atmospheric, but also there's moments with like a bathtub and a creepy little kid and things like that. So I had a great time with it. I also buddy read it with a friend, and both of us were like, what the heck? So I really enjoyed it. A great one for staying up late and reading if you want to scare yourself. But like I said, if you're used to scarier things, this is not going to be probably your cup of tea. It's also quite tropey, but I didn't care. I had a great time with it. Next up, we have A Court of Thorns and Roses. I probably don't need to get very far into the premise of this. Most of you know it's a Beauty and the Beast retelling with fae, and it's very romance heavy. The first one is not actually that heavy on the sexy time, but from what I read of the second one, it gets very into the sexy time, and that's kind of one of the big things that pulls people in, especially the character relationships. I am not somebody who typically wants that much focus on the romance in my fantasy, so if you're like me, then this is probably going to be a miss for you, but for most people, it's a huge plus. It's kind of light fantasy light, romance heavy. Similar things can be said for Serpent and Dove. It's not a fae or Beauty and the Beast retelling, but it does follow a woman who is a witch who lives in this French-inspired setting where they are not fans of witches, and she's living in secret, and through some very bizarre circumstances finds herself married to a witch hunter, and she's trying to not let him find out. And then there's all this tension between them, and it was fun. It was fun, kind of like From Blood and Ash. I feel like if that's something that you enjoy and you're in the mood for it, you're probably gonna love it. I, again, just to kind of reiterate the same points, typically don't want that much romance in my stories, my fantasy stories. So for me, it's not my favorite, but definitely check it out if you love romance in your fantasy. Last on the list would be A Curse So Dark and Lonely. This one is a Beauty and the Beast retelling, like A Court of Thorns and Roses, but the story and the characters are very different. The idea is that this girl from our world, Harper, gets kind of transported to a fantasy world, so it is a portal fantasy, and she is currently meeting the prince in his prince form, but at the end of the season, if she doesn't fall in love with him, and if the other girls who have met him haven't fallen in love with him, then he turns into a monster that kills a bunch of people, and then the cycle repeats. The cycle has repeated over and over and over again. He is exhausted. He does not want to hurt anyone else because he has already hurt people, and it's a dual point of view between her and him. I really enjoyed this one. I thought it was so fun. We do have this continue on into the second and third books. I do think it could have been a standalone. The first book is my favorite, but overall, if you're in the mood for a really fun story that's kind of a nice balance between romance and adventure, then I think you're going to really like this one. If you'd like more information about any of the books I talked about, if I have reviews, I'll have them linked down below, as well as purchase links if you'd like to check any of them out. Let me know what some of your books that you've picked up because of Booktok are, or let me know of some books that you've seen because of Booktok and you're interested in. But anyway, thanks so much for watching. I hope you have a great rest of your day, and I'll see you all later. Bye.